The cream envelope slid across the walnut table, stopping at my hand as if my in-laws were merely completing an end-of-quarter cleanup. My husband sat frozen, staring into his wine. His mother smiled, convinced of her own graciousness. They believed they were buying the disappearance of a civil servant, a woman entirely out of their class. They had no idea how badly they had misjudged me. My name is Rose Whitmore. I am 34 years old. Tonight, I am wearing a simple black dress. It is the kind of dress that belongs in a quiet, unassuming restaurant in Charleston, not in the cavernous, suffocating dining room of the Vale family estate. The mansion sits in the heart of Buckhead, Atlanta. It is a fortress of old money, heavy gates, and new arrogance. Everything in this room is meticulously curated to project dominance. The ceiling is far too high. The chandelier above us is a dripping mass of imported crystal that casts a fractured, icy light across the dark walnut table. The sterling silver forks and knives sit at precise, intimidating angles against the blinding white of the table linen. The floral centerpiece, a dense cluster of rare white orchids, is low enough to allow eye contact, but thick enough to feel like a barricade. It is a suffocating kind of luxury. It is a perfection so absolute that it feels entirely hostile. The air is heavy. It smells of expensive wax, roasted pheasant, and polished wood. But beneath it all, it smells of sterile, calculated intent. Across the great expanse of walnut sit my parents-in-law, Victor and Lenora Vale. They eat with the mechanical grace of people who have never had to rush a single moment of their lives. Victor cuts his meat with surgical precision. His face is an unreadable mask of corporate authority. Lenora sips her deep red Bordeaux. Her features are smoothed into a mask of polite, glacial serenity. The atmosphere in the room is relentlessly polite. It is freezing. To my right sits Graham Vale, my husband. Usually, Graham is the buffer between me and this suffocating world. He is the one who holds my hand under the table. He is the one who shares secret, mocking glances with me when his mother talks about her endless charity galas. Not tonight. Tonight, Graham is a statue. He has not spoken a single word since the appetizer was served. He stares down at his half-empty wine glass. He traces the thin crystal rim with his index finger. He refuses to look at me. He has refused to meet my eyes since we walked through the grand double doors of this house. The silence stretches. It is broken only by the sharp clink of silver against porcelain. Then, the small talk begins. It is utterly hollow. Victor mentions a minor fluctuation in the southern energy markets. Lenora talks about the upcoming spring benefit for the symphony orchestra. I offer brief, measured responses. I do not volunteer information. I know how to play this game. I have played it for 2 years. But tonight, the rules feel different. The air pressure in the room has dropped. The board is tilted. Dessert is cleared away. The servants vanish like ghosts into the hidden corridors of the house. The heavy mahogany doors click shut. We are alone. Victor dabs his mouth with a linen napkin. He places it precisely beside his empty plate. He leans back in his high-backed leather chair and folds his hands over his stomach. He looks at me. His eyes are flat and assessing. He looks like a man appraising a parcel of land he intends to pave over. "Rose," Victor begins. His voice is a low, rumbling baritone. It carries the effortless authority of a chief executive officer used to unquestioning obedience. "We have always appreciated your quiet nature. You are a sensible woman, pragmatic, grounded." He reaches inside his tailored suit jacket. He withdraws a thick, cream-colored envelope. He places it on the polished wood. With one manicured finger, he pushes it across the table. It slides with a soft, scraping sound. It travels the length of the walnut surface and stops exactly in front of my hands. "This," Victor says, gesturing slightly toward the paper, "is an amicable solution for everyone." I do not reach for it immediately. I look at the envelope. It is made of heavy, expensive stock. It is the kind of stationery used for declaring war or announcing corporate mergers. The Vale family crest is blind embossed in the upper corner. I look at Victor. Then, I look at Graham. My husband flinches. Just a fraction of an inch. He swallows hard. His gaze remains fixed on his glass. My fingers brush the edge of the textured paper. I lift the unsealed flap. I pull the folded documents free. They make a crisp, dry sound in the quiet room. There are several pages of dense legal text printed in a sharp, unforgiving font. Resting neatly on top of the legal maneuvering is a cashier's check. I look at the numbers printed on the face of the check. I do not blink. I read the amount in my head. $5 million. It is a staggering sum for a woman who drives an old sport utility vehicle and budgets strictly for her weekly grocery runs. To them, it is a rounding error. It is the cost of doing business. It is the price of waste disposal. I slide the check slightly to the side to reveal the documents underneath. It is a formal separation agreement. The terms are laid out in stark, undeniable black and white. It requires me to vacate our marital home in South Carolina. It demands that I sever all legal and financial ties to Graham immediately. Then, my eyes catch on a specific section. It is a strict, ironclad non-disclosure agreement. It demands total silence. I am forbidden from discussing the marriage. I am forbidden from discussing the family dynamics. Most notably, there is a fiercely punitive clause demanding absolute secrecy regarding any sensitive commercial information I might have been exposed to during the marriage. It states that I must sign the papers and be completely gone from their sphere within 30 days. 30 days to erase a marriage. $5 million to buy my silence. The room holds its breath. They are waiting for the explosion. They are waiting for the tears, the screaming, the throwing of the crystal wine glass. They expect the messy, emotional outburst of a woman who has just been discarded by her betters. I feel my heart beat against my ribs. It is a slow, steady, drum-like rhythm. The anger is there, burning hot and bright, but it is locked away behind a thick wall of ice. I do not cry. I do not raise my voice. I place the documents back onto the table. I align the edges perfectly with the edge of the wood. My absolute stillness makes the room feel even more suffocating. Lenora leans forward. The diamonds at her throat catch the chandelier light. She offers a smile that is softer than velvet and twice as toxic. "You are a smart girl, Rose," Lenora says. Her tone is gentle, maternal, and dripping with condescension. "We simply want what is best for Graham. His life is becoming incredibly complex. His future position requires a certain type of foundation. You are still young. You have your whole life ahead of you. With this settlement, you can start over in a place that is much more suitable for you. A place where you will be comfortable." Suitable, comfortable. She means a place where I belong. A place far away from their pristine, gilded cage. She means I am a civil servant, a woman with a modest government salary, an outsider who managed to slip past the velvet rope, but who now must be escorted out by security. They think they are generously sweeping out the trash. I let her words hang in the air. I do not defend my background. I do not justify my worth to a woman whose only achievement is marrying a bank account. The silence stretches out, growing heavier and more oppressive by the second. My calmness becomes a physical weight in the room. I can see Victor shift uncomfortably in his chair. Lenora's perfect smile tightens slightly at the corners. They do not know how to handle a target that refuses to bleed. I turn my head slowly. The movement feels mechanical. I look at Graham. The man I married in a small, sunlit ceremony by the water. The man who used to hold my hand while we ate cheap seafood on paper plates and talked about building a real life together. "Did you know about this?" I ask. My voice is quiet. It does not shake. Graham finally lifts his head. His eyes are bloodshot and evasive. His face is the color of ash. He opens his mouth, but his throat works uselessly. No words come out. He looks across the table at his father like a frightened boy seeking permission to speak. Then he looks down at the table again. He gives a microscopic, agonizing nod. That is the true killing blow. It is not the check for $5 million. It is not Lenora's thinly veiled insults about my breeding. It is not Victor's ruthless corporate execution. It is the man sitting beside me. The betrayal is absolute. He knew. He sat in on the strategic meetings with the family lawyers. He let them draft the papers. He drove with me to this house, walked into this dining room, sat down, ate his dinner, and waited in silence for his father to fire his wife. He is not a victim of his family's overreach. He is a willing participant. He is a coward. A strange, cold clarity washes over me. The love I had for him, the hope I held for this marriage, simply evaporates. It leaves behind a clean, sharp, empty space. They think I am a naive woman from a coastal town who will take the money and run back to obscurity. They think my existence is defined by my modest apartment and my plain black dress. They do not know Nolan Whitmore. They do not know that the man who taught me how to fish on a quiet river in Georgia is the same man who holds the reins of their entire empire. They think they are swatting away a fly. They do not realize they are waking a leviathan. I stand up. The heavy wooden chair scrapes against the hardwood floor. The sound is shockingly loud in the silent room. I do not touch the envelope. I leave it sitting exactly where Victor pushed it. I smooth the front of my dress. I pick up my small clutch purse from the empty chair beside me. Victor is watching me closely. His brow is furrowed. He is profoundly confused by my lack of compliance. He is a man who is used to people either taking the bribe or begging for more. I am doing neither. I look directly into Victor Vale's cold, calculating eyes. I let the silence stretch for one more unbearable second. "You should keep that money," I say. My voice is perfectly level. It cuts through the thick, perfumed air like a surgical blade. "It is highly likely you will need it more than I do in the near future." Victor's frown deepens. A flash of genuine, unscripted confusion crosses his face. Lenora gasps, a tiny, offended sound that gets caught in her throat. Graham just stares at me, his mouth slightly open, looking like a man who has just watched a ghost walk out of the wall. I do not wait for a response. I turn my back on them. I walk out of the grand dining room. My heels click rhythmically against the marble floor of the endless hallway. I do not look back. I push open the heavy front doors and step out into the cool Atlanta night. The air outside is crisp and clean. I breathe it in deeply. The game has changed. And they have absolutely no idea they have already lost. 2 years before I sat in that freezing, opulent dining room in Atlanta, my life had an entirely different texture. It smelled of salt marsh, rain-wet asphalt, and old paper, not imported wax and roasted pheasant. I lived in a second-floor walk-up apartment in the historic district of Charleston, South Carolina. It was a modest space. The floors sloped slightly toward the front windows, and the exposed brick walls held a draft in the winter, but it was completely mine. I drove a 12-year-old sport utility vehicle that had a persistent, rhythmic rattle deep inside the dashboard. I liked the rattle. It reminded me that things required maintenance, that nothing in the world ran perfectly without a little honest effort. I preferred spending my evenings in my tiny kitchen, chopping vegetables and cooking my own meals, rather than navigating crowded, overpriced restaurants where the food was an afterthought to the status of securing a table. I had an absolute, fundamental allergy to pretension. My days were spent under the harsh, humming fluorescent lights of the Coastal Recovery Authority. After a devastating hurricane had torn through the Atlantic seaboard the previous year, federal and state funds flooded the region to rebuild the shattered infrastructure. Where there is a sudden flood of government money, there is always a swarm of opportunists looking to fill their pockets. My job was to stand firmly in the doorway and check their credentials. I audited recovery contracts, specifically focusing on the massive efforts to repair power grids and public utilities. The work demanded a forensic, agonizing level of attention to detail. I spent countless hours cross-referencing thick shipping manifests, verifying equipment serial numbers, and hunting down the invisible threads that connected phantom subcontractors to bloated, fraudulent invoices. I had a talent for spotting a lie hiding quietly inside a spreadsheet. I was built for the unglamorous, solitary work of keeping people honest. I was fiercely independent, calm under pressure, and inherently skeptical. I paid my own rent. I paid my own utility bills. I did not need to wear a designer label or stand next to a powerful man to understand my own value in the world. That quiet, unshakable confidence was not something I learned in a university lecture hall. It was handed down to me by a man who lived 2 states away, on a sprawling, untamed stretch of riverfront in Georgia. My father, Nolan Whitmore, spent his mornings on a battered aluminum skiff and his afternoons tinkering with grease-covered outboard motors in a shed that smelled strongly of gasoline and wet earth. If you saw him standing in line at the local hardware store, wearing his faded canvas work jacket, oil-stained denim jeans, and worn-out leather boots, you would assume he was a retired dock worker living strictly on a fixed monthly pension. You would never guess that the man buying a $5 box of nails could purchase the hardware store, the commercial block it sat on, and the regional bank that held the mortgage, all in cash, before he finished his morning coffee. My father raised me alone after my mother passed away when I was very young. He did not raise me in country clubs, private boarding schools, or corporate boardrooms. He raised me on the water. He taught me how to read the turning tide, how to weather sudden storms, and how to fix things when they broke. He kept his immense wealth completely invisible to the outside world. He despised the performative circus of the ultra-rich. He had one core principle, a rule he repeated to me every time I reached a new milestone in my life. "Rose," he would say, wiping grease from his hands with a red shop rag. "Never let your money introduce you before your character gets a chance to speak." I took that lesson to heart. I built a life that was entirely my own, insulated from the distorting gravity of his bank accounts. That was the quiet, grounded life I was living when Graham Vale walked into it. It was a fiercely humid Tuesday evening in late September. I had just survived a brutal 4-hour public hearing regarding severe, unexplained delays in electrical equipment shipments to a battered coastal county. The room had been full of angry mayors and defensive contractors. I was physically exhausted, nursing a throbbing headache behind my eyes, and craving nothing but a basket of fried shrimp and a cold drink. I walked into a tiny, weathered seafood shack near the harbor. It was the kind of local place that featured peeling blue paint, paper napkins in plastic dispensers, and a menu written on a chalkboard. He was sitting 2 stools down at the worn wooden bar. He did not look like the slick, defensive corporate men I usually interrogated at the hearings. He was wearing a rumpled button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, looking just as tired and worn down as I felt. When the bartender accidentally bumped a water pitcher and sent a wave of ice water cascading across the counter, soaking the man's notebook, he did not snap. He did not raise his voice or demand to see the manager. He just laughed, grabbed a thick handful of paper towels, helped the bartender wipe up the mess, and calmly ordered another round. We started talking. It began as a shared commiseration over the unbearable humidity and the terrible traffic on the bridge, but it quickly deepened. He was articulate, sharply observant, and genuinely funny. He asked me about my day, and when I vaguely mentioned the administrative chaos of public utility contracts, his eyes lit up. He understood the complex nuances of supply chains and grid logistics immediately. He did not possess the hollow, performative charm of the wealthy men I occasionally encountered in my line of work. He felt grounded. He felt like a real person. He told me his name was Graham. He said he worked in logistics for energy distribution. It was not a lie, exactly, but it was a masterclass in strategic omission. We went on 3 dates before I finally learned the rest of the story. We were walking along the Battery one evening, watching the cargo ships drift across the harbor, when a colleague of mine stopped to say hello. After my colleague walked away, he made an offhand comment about the Vale Meridian grid. It was the massive power infrastructure and smart grid conglomerate that practically owned the electrical veins of the entire American South. Graham stopped walking. He looked out at the dark water, took a long, deep breath, and finally confessed the truth. He was not just a mid-level logistics manager, he was Graham Vale. His father was the chief executive officer of the corporation. He was the direct heir apparent to an empire that moved billions of dollars every single quarter. He braced himself physically, waiting for the inevitable shift. He was entirely accustomed to the shift. He was used to the sudden widening of a woman's eyes, the subtle, calculating change in her vocal pitch, and the immediate recalculation of his worth. He was used to people wanting something from him the moment they heard his last name. I just looked at him, shrugged my shoulders, and started walking again. "That sounds like an exhausting amount of pressure," I said casually, looking back at him. "Does that mean you are paying for the ice cream tonight?" He let out a shaky breath that sounded like he had been holding it inside his chest for 10 years. That was the exact moment he became captivated by me. He was completely drawn in by the fact that my attitude toward him did not change 1/fraction of a percent. I did not suddenly defer to his opinions. I did not treat him like a walking, breathing bank account. To me, he was still just the tired, polite guy at the seafood shack who helped wipe up a spilled drink, because I did not need his money to feel secure. He felt safe with me. Our relationship was built in the quiet, unpretentious corners of the city. We spent our evenings in noisy local diners, sharing plates of fries and arguing playfully about state politics. We took long, aimless drives in my rattling vehicle, listening to the radio and talking for hours about everything and nothing. We did not attend charity galas. We did not go to exclusive, members-only country clubs. He seemed to desperately crave the anonymity, the simple, unvarnished reality of my working-class world. I thought we were building a sanctuary. I thought we were creating a safe, insulated space where the heavy, crushing expectations of his family name could not reach us. I believed we were building a genuine partnership, brick by brick, entirely removed from the cold, transactional nature of his family's universe. I loved his sharp mind, his apparent kindness, and the way he looked at me like I was the only real thing in a world made entirely of plastic and corporate strategy. I trusted the solid foundation we had built because it felt so profoundly ordinary. I gave him my absolute trust. I did not realize until 2 years later, sitting across from that walnut dining table, that while I thought I was building a permanent home, he was merely taking a temporary vacation from his real life. We had held a small, sunlit wedding ceremony in the coastal town of Beaufort. The air had smelled of salt and blooming jasmine, and standing there by the water, everything had felt entirely manageable. Graham had held both of my hands and promised me that his family simply needed a little time to adjust. He swore that once the ring was on my finger and the marriage was official, the invisible drawbridge to their fortress would finally lower. He was wrong. The drawbridge did not lower. Instead, the moat surrounding the Vale family simply grew wider, deeper, and infinitely colder. The exclusion was not loud. It was not overtly aggressive. The ultra-wealthy do not scream. They simply erase you. My mother-in-law, Lenora, was a masterclass in aggressive unavailability. She never outright refused an invitation to lunch, coffee, or a simple afternoon visit. That would have been terribly unrefined and would have given me a tangible grievance to hold against her. Instead, she deployed an endless, impenetrable arsenal of high society obligations to keep me securely at arm's length. "Oh, Rose, darling," she would sigh through the telephone, her voice dripping with perfectly manufactured regret. "I am simply drowning in preparations for the Children's Hospital Charity Gala this week. And next Tuesday, Victor and I are flying down to the Palm Beach estate to oversee the new landscaping. My calendar is an absolute nightmare. We absolutely must find a window next month." Next month, of course, never arrived. It was a polite, sterile quarantine. I was family on paper, but in practice, I was treated like a mild contagion that needed to be managed from a safe distance. When I was inevitably required to attend the mandatory family functions, the holiday dinners, or the quarterly obligatory Sunday brunches at their country club, the isolation became a physical weight. The women of the Vale social circle did not glare at me. They did not whisper behind their hands. They simply scanned me. Every time I walked into a room, I could feel their eyes conducting a silent, rigorous inventory of my existence. They were measuring the thread count and the cut of my dress. They were calculating the absence of a recognizable luxury designer logo on my handbag They were noting the distinct lack of a heavy diamond-encrusted Swiss timepiece on my wrist. I wore a simple, functional watch with a brown leather band. To them, it might as well have been a neon sign flashing the word outsider above my head. They would ask me polite, hollow questions about my profession, their smiles perfectly fixed and their eyes entirely vacant, waiting for me to finish speaking so they could return to discussing their interior decorators. Then there was Carter Vale. Graham's older brother was the heir apparent in theory, though his arrogance frequently outpaced his actual competence. Carter treated me with the kind of amused condescension one might reserve for a slightly slow, mildly entertaining pet. The breaking point with Carter happened during a cocktail party on the terrace of their estate. The conversation among the men had turned toward infrastructure legislation and government oversight. I made a mild, entirely factual observation regarding federal regulatory compliance. Carter stopped swirling his expensive scotch. He gave a short, patronizing laugh, looked at Graham with a smirk, and then turned his gaze down to me. "That is the truly charming thing about the public sector, Rose," Carter said, his lips curling into a smug, triumphant smile. "You all sit in your little offices, read the rule books, and think that is how the machinery actually operates. You simply do not understand how the real world works. Out here, we do not read the rules. We write them." I waited for Graham to say something. I looked to my husband, fully expecting him to defend my intelligence, or at least intervene and change the subject to diffuse the insult. Instead, Graham just offered a weak, apologetic smile, gently placed his hand on the small of my back, and steered me toward the catering tables. That was the exact moment the first deep, irreparable fracture appeared in the foundation of my marriage. Graham's behavior began to shift shortly after that, manifesting in microscopic, infuriating ways. He started trying to manage my personality. Before we visited his parents, he would subtly inspect my outfit, suggesting a different pair of earrings or a more conservative pair of shoes. During the car rides to Atlanta, he would offer unsolicited, defensive advice on conversation topics. "Maybe do not talk so much about the state audits tonight, sweetie," he would say, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the highway ahead. "My father gets enough compliance talk at the office. Just let them see you softer. Let them see the sweet, easygoing woman I married." It hit me with the force of a physical blow in the passenger seat of that car. Graham did not actually want me to integrate into his world as an equal. He liked the disparity. He liked that I came from a quiet, modest background. It made him feel powerful. In his own mind, he was the benevolent, wealthy prince who had reached down and elevated the working-class commoner. If I showed my teeth, if I demonstrated that I was sharper, tougher, and more capable than the legacy-funded women he grew up around, it threatened his entire identity. He needed me to be soft, naive, and slightly out of my depth so he could feel strong. He was not opening doors for me. He was keeping me in a very specific, controllable box. This intense hyperfixation on my image was not happening in a vacuum. The Vale family was on the precipice of a monumental corporate transition. Vale Meridian Grid was aggressively preparing for a massive merger with Halcyon Utility Software, a cutting-edge technology firm. The merger would effectively give the Vales a total, unbreakable monopoly over the smart grid infrastructure of the entire southern region. The financial stakes were astronomical. The public relations team was working furiously to polish the family's image for the financial press and the nervous shareholders. They desperately needed the narrative of a stable, unified, flawless dynasty. An outspoken, fiercely independent daughter-in-law who chased corrupt government contractors for a living was a wild card they absolutely did not want in their perfectly stacked deck. Their paranoia reached a level I had not anticipated. I found out by pure, unexpected accident that they had dug into my past. A friend from my hometown, who worked as a supervisor at the county clerk's office, called me one afternoon. She casually mentioned that a high-end corporate background-checking firm based out of Atlanta had been persistently pulling public financial records on both my father and me. The Vale family had actually hired private investigators to dig through every corner of my life. I knew exactly what the investigators had found, or rather, what they thought they had found. They found a woman making a modest, transparent state salary. They found a father living quietly in a worn-down cabin on the river, driving a battered truck, with zero political connections, zero visible trust funds, and absolutely no social leverage in their circles. The investigators undoubtedly delivered a neat, reassuring report to Victor Vale that concluded I was exactly what I appeared to be, a hardworking nobody who posed absolutely no threat to their empire. When I first realized I had been investigated like a corporate spy or a criminal suspect, I felt a flash of intense, burning violation, but as the anger settled into my chest, a cold, crystalline clarity took its place. They had looked at the surface and arrogantly assumed they understood the depths. They were so utterly blinded by their own elitism, so fundamentally convinced that power only wore tailored suits and held exclusive memberships at gated country clubs, that they failed to look closer. They believed I was entirely defenseless. They believed I had no teeth, no claws, and no recourse. They were busy cataloging my sensible shoes and my cheap watch, entirely missing the profound reality of the situation. Their absolute certainty in my insignificance was their greatest vulnerability. I stopped trying to prove my worth to Lenora. I stopped arguing with Carter when he made his condescending jokes. I even stopped fighting Graham on his cowardly, subtle attempts to manage my behavior. I became perfectly quiet. I became a meticulous, silent observer in their home, because I knew, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that their breathtaking arrogance was going to cause them to make a catastrophic mistake. They were so used to stepping on people that they no longer looked down to see what they were crushing. I began to watch their every move, waiting for the inevitable misstep, fully aware that this quiet contempt would soon lead to a war they were entirely unprepared to fight. The invitation to a private family dinner came through Lenora's assistant, which told me everything I needed to know. By the time dessert was cleared and the envelope appeared, I understood this was not a family conversation. It was a corporate dismissal dressed up as civility. The real shock was not the money. It was the commercial gag order buried in the papers, and the fact that Graham had agreed to put it in front of me. The tires of my old vehicle hummed a heavy, monotonous rhythm against the asphalt of the interstate highway. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. I had been driving straight south for 4 hours, leaving the manufactured perfection of the Atlanta suburbs far behind me. The dashboard lights cast a faint, amber glow inside the cold cabin. I did not turn on the radio. I needed the absolute silence. I did not shed a single tear during the entire journey down to the state line. Crying requires a genuine sense of loss, and I had already realized that I had not lost a loyal partner. I had merely uncovered a coward hiding behind a very expensive suit. I was not driving into the night because I felt broken. I was not fleeing to my father to beg for a rescue or to hide from the humiliation. I was driving because I needed to speak the ugliest truth aloud to the only person in the world who would hear it without pity. The true wound was not the $5 million check. It was not the mother-in-law who looked at me like dirt on her pristine rug. The true, agonizing wound was the simple fact that Graham had let me sit completely alone at that table and face a firing squad he had helped assemble. Nolan Whitmore was awake when my headlights finally swept across the crushed gravel driveway of his riverfront property in Georgia. He was always a light sleeper, a habit formed from decades of waking up before the tide turned. The small, weathered wooden house stood completely dark except for the warm, yellow square of light glowing from the kitchen window. When I pushed the heavy wooden door open, the air inside was thick with the rich, peppery smell of a leftover gumbo simmering slowly on the cast iron stove. My father stood near the counter. He was wearing a faded flannel shirt and worn denim trousers. He did not rush forward to smother me in a frantic embrace. He simply looked at my face, read the rigid tension in my jaw, and reached into the cupboard to pull down 2 heavy ceramic mugs. He poured black coffee, slid 1 mug across the worn butcher block island, and picked up a wooden spoon to stir the pot on the stove. He sat there, I said. My voice was raspy from the long silence of the drive. He knew exactly what they were going to do. He reviewed the documents, and he sat right next to me and let his father slide the envelope across the table. Nolan did not flinch. He did not offer empty, soothing platitudes. He listened to the entire story while he continued to stir the simmering broth. He listened with the sharp, clinical focus of a seasoned mechanic diagnosing a catastrophic failure deep inside an engine block. I told him about the chilling dinner, the meticulously drafted separation agreement, and the crushing realization of Graham's complicity. Finally, I detailed the specific, aggressive non-disclosure clause regarding commercial data and vendor relationships. My father stopped stirring. He tapped the wooden spoon thoughtfully against the edge of the cast-iron pot. He leaned against the counter and crossed his arms over his chest. His eyes, usually warm and crinkled at the corners, turned entirely sharp. People who simply want a quiet, polite divorce do not draft commercial gag orders, Nolan said softly. His voice was a low rumble in the quiet kitchen. If a wealthy family simply believes you are socially beneath them, they buy your silence regarding their personal embarrassments. They protect their social standing. But when they explicitly forbid you from discussing their supply chains and internal data, they are no longer protecting their pride. They are protecting their survival. They are terrified of you. Rose, I am an auditor for a state recovery agency, I replied, wrapping my cold hands around the hot ceramic mug. They look at me and see a glorified clerk with a calculator. No, my father corrected me smoothly. They look at you and see a woman who knows exactly how to read a fraudulent invoice. They see someone positioned dangerously close to the exact government contracts they rely upon. You need to ask yourself why they chose this specific week to push you out the door. The timing is never an accident in corporate strategy. He turned off the burner under the pot. He walked around the kitchen island and pulled out a wooden stool, sitting down directly across from me. He looked deeply into my eyes, his expression shifting from analytical to profoundly serious. I have never cared for the performative theater of wealthy men, Nolan began, his tone carrying a weight I rarely heard. I raised you out here on the river because I wanted you to understand the value of your own two hands. I wanted you to build a character that did not require a bank statement to validate its existence. I wanted you to be loved for exactly who you are as a human being, not viewed as a convenient, walking doorway into a bank vault. I frowned, slightly confused by the sudden philosophical shift in his tone. I know that, Dad. I do not care about their money. I know you do not, Nolan said. He rested his large, calloused hands flat on the wooden counter. But you need to understand the precise mechanics of the battlefield you just walked onto. You believe the Vale family holds all the leverage because they control Vale Meridian Grid. You believe they are untouchable. He paused for a long moment. The silence in the kitchen was absolute, save for the distant, rhythmic sound of the river washing against the wooden docks outside. They do not own the entire board, my father stated flatly. I do not just have money sitting in index funds. Rose, I own approximately $8 billion of their company. I stopped breathing for a second. The number did not compute in my exhausted brain. I stared at the man in the faded flannel shirt, the man who spent his weekends fixing broken outboard motors with grease under his fingernails. You own what? I whispered. $8 billion, Nolan repeated, articulating the words with absolute clarity. I am the single largest individual shareholder outside of the immediate Vale bloodline. Over a decade ago, before Graham was even out of university, that corporation was practically drowning in a massive ocean of toxic debt. They were weeks away from a brutal restructuring that would have wiped the family out entirely. I stepped in. I bought a massive block of equity when it was priced like scrap metal. He took a slow sip of his black coffee, his eyes never leaving mine. Crucially, I did not just buy standard stock. I structured the capital injection to secure a very specific class of preferred shares. Those shares carry a built-in, unyielding veto power over any major corporate governance changes, including executive appointments and large-scale mergers. The sheer scale of the revelation hit me like a physical shockwave. The arrogant, untouchable family that had just offered me a $5 million severance package to disappear was entirely dependent on the goodwill of the man sitting across from me eating leftover stew. "Do they know?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Do Victor and Lenora know it is you?" Nolan shook his head slightly. "They know a private investor named Whitmore saved their necks a long time ago. But corporate memory is remarkably short when arrogance takes over. Several different executive teams have cycled through that boardroom since then. They interact with my holding company through proxy lawyers. They have completely forgotten the face of the man who holds the paper, and they have blissfully forgotten the true scale of the leverage I maintain over their operations." He reached out and gently placed his rough hand over mine. The warmth of his grip anchored me in the spinning room. "I kept it hidden because I never wanted the gravity of that wealth to warp your life," Nolan said softly. "I wanted you to find a man who looked at you and saw a partner, not a strategic acquisition. I am deeply sorry that Graham turned out to be the latter." "We have to stop them," I said, a sudden fierce heat rising in my chest. "We can walk into that boardroom tomorrow and tear their entire merger to the ground. We can take everything from them." "We could," Nolan agreed calmly, entirely unbothered by my sudden surge of anger. "But we will not do that today. Dropping a hammer blindly makes a loud noise, but it rarely fixes the underlying problem." He squeezed my hand before pulling back and picking up his mug again. "The most expensive lesson a person can learn in this life does not involve losing a financial investment," Nolan said, his voice dropping to a smooth, razor-sharp register. "The most expensive lesson is realizing you have severely misjudged the person sitting quietly at your own dining room table. The Vales thought they were amputating a useless limb. They did not realize they were severing their own life support." I sat back on my stool. The overwhelming exhaustion of the night began to recede, replaced by a cold, highly focused energy. The tears I had refused to shed on the highway were entirely gone, burned away by the pure, unadulterated power of the truth. "We do not strike yet," my father instructed quietly. "If they are desperate enough to force a commercial gag order into a marital separation, there is a very specific rot hiding inside their ledger. You are an auditor, Rose. You know how to track the rot. You go back to your office. You open your files. You find exactly what they are so terrified you might see. Once we have the weapon, then we walk into their fortress." I looked at the dark window, seeing my own reflection faintly superimposed over the deep black of the river outside. I was no longer the discarded wife fleeing into the night. I was the architect of their impending ruin. "I will find it," I said. My father smiled. It was a small, dangerous smile that promised absolute devastation. "I know you will," he replied. Monday morning arrived with the comforting, sterile hum of fluorescent lights. The offices of the Coastal Recovery Authority smelled of stale coffee, hot copy toner, and overworked air conditioning. I sat at my metal desk, entirely barricaded behind towering stacks of manila vendor files and 3 glowing monitors. It was the perfect environment for a woman who needed to quietly, methodically dissect a monster. My current assignment was a massive backlog of emergency payment authorizations. After a devastating Category 4 hurricane had flattened the southern coastline the previous autumn, hundreds of millions of dollars in federal and state relief funds had been deployed to replace the obliterated electrical substations. Vile Meridian Grid was the primary manufacturer of the heavy infrastructure, but strict state laws required independent, third-party contractors to handle the actual logistics, site preparation, and transportation to prevent a corporate monopoly. I pulled up a master spreadsheet detailing the eastern seaboard supply chain. I was looking for irregularities, the tiny invisible threads that indicated financial friction. Within 2 hours of cross-referencing the state invoices against the approved vendor index, a distinct, repetitive pattern began to emerge. A single logistical contractor kept appearing in the margins of the largest, most expensive equipment transfers. The name on the invoices was Blue Run Field Services. According to the official paperwork, Blue Run was responsible for expediting emergency transformers and high-voltage transmission components from Vale Meridian warehouses directly to the shattered disaster zones. But the numbers printed on the screen did not align with physical reality. I opened a massive invoice submitted during the absolute peak of the crisis. Blue Run had billed the state taxpayer fund $350,000 for the expedited transport and securing of 2 heavy-duty substations. The standard, heavily regulated emergency rate for that exact logistical maneuver was closer to $120,000. It was an inexplicable markup of almost 200%. I leaned closer to the monitor and dug deeper into the alphanumeric shipment codes. It was a tedious, agonizing process of comparing long strings of numbers across dozens of digitized shipping manifests. Then, I found the fatal flaw. A massive spool of industrial copper wiring had been billed to the state 3 separate times, on 3 different dates, using the exact same manufacturer's serial number. It was not a careless administrative error. It was a deliberate, systematic duplication. Someone was billing the government for phantom equipment, and executives at Vail Meridian Grid were actively rubber-stamping the physical release forms to validate the fraud. Who exactly was Blue Run Field Services? I opened a secure terminal and accessed the public state corporate registry. Blue Run had been incorporated a mere 8 months prior to the hurricane. Their listed corporate headquarters was not a sprawling logistical depot with a fleet of heavy trucks and a massive staging yard. It was a suite number in a generic strip mall in Wilmington. My geographic mapping software quickly identified the address as a virtual mailbox drop. The contractor possessed no physical assets, no heavy machinery, and no payroll history prior to the storm. Yet, they were consistently prioritized for the most lucrative, critical emergency contracts in the state. I followed the paper trail upward. Blue Run was owned by a holding company registered in Delaware. That holding company, in turn, was managed by a boutique private equity fund based out of Atlanta. I pulled up the public filing for the investment fund. The managing director was listed in plain text. The name sent a sharp, freezing jolt straight down my spine. I knew the name intimately. I had sat across from him at several mind-numbingly dull charity galas over the last 2 years. He was a prominent fixture in the Atlanta social scene and, more importantly, he was one of Carter Vail's closest friends. The entire structure was a closed, perfectly circular loop. Carter Vail was using his senior executive influence at Vail Meridian Grid to ensure the emergency state contracts were funneled directly to his friend's empty shell company. The shell company inflated the prices astronomically, billed the state relief fund, and then kicked the illicit profits back through the private equity firm. They were actively profiteering off a natural disaster, draining taxpayer recovery funds into their own pockets while coastal towns sat in the dark. "Rose," a voice called out, breaking my intense concentration. I instantly minimized the windows on my screen and looked up. My supervisor, David, stood in the doorway of my cubicle. He was holding a thick manila envelope and looked exceptionally tired. "I just got off a massive conference call with the governor's office," David said, leaning against the gray fabric partition. "They are launching a comprehensive, independent audit of all infrastructure suppliers involved in the post-storm recovery. The press got wind of some budgetary anomalies, and the state attorney general is demanding a full review for price gouging. They want us to start pulling the master files for all logistics contractors today." My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs, but my face remained an absolute mask of professional calm. "When does the independent committee arrive to review our data?" I asked smoothly. "Next week," David replied, rubbing his temples in frustration. "It is going to be a total nightmare. Make sure your sectors are completely clean and fully documented." "Understood," I said. David walked away, leaving me alone in the quiet hum of the office. I stared at my blank screen. In a single, blinding flash of insight, the entire universe snapped into perfect, terrifying focus. The rushed private dinner at the Buckhead estate, the carefully orchestrated separation agreement pushed across the walnut table, the cashier's check for $5 million, and most importantly, the hyper-specific, fiercely punitive non-disclosure clause explicitly forbidding me from discussing sensitive commercial data or vendor relationships. The Vail family was not simply trying to remove a socially undesirable, working-class daughter-in-law from their pristine family tree, they were engaged in a frantic, desperate legal containment protocol. Carter knew the state audit was coming. He knew the Attorney General was starting to sniff around the hurricane relief funds. And he realized, with absolute paralyzing horror, that his brother's wife sat at the exact epicenter of the regulatory agency preparing to launch the massive investigation. I was too close. I was far too clean. As a senior state auditor, if I accidentally stumbled across the Blue Run invoices while eating breakfast at their kitchen table, or if I recognized Carter's friend's name on a vendor approval form casually left on a desk, I would be legally obligated to report it. They needed me legally severed from the family and permanently gagged by an ironclad confidentiality agreement before the state subpoenas started flying. They wanted me to leave quietly, clutching a check, completely stripped of my voice and my credibility. They feared my proximity far more than they despised my background. A reckless, emotional person would have immediately downloaded the files to a portable drive and rushed to the press to scream about the betrayal. But I was not reckless. I was a professional investigator. I knew that the slightest deviation from legal protocol could render the evidence entirely inadmissible and give the Vale family's army of ruthless corporate lawyers an easy avenue to destroy my career and bury the truth. I opened a blank, formal memorandum document on my desktop. I addressed it directly to the Internal Ethics Committee of the Coastal Recovery Authority. The subject line was simple: Declaration of Conflict of Interest. I typed with absolute surgical precision. I formally declared that my marital relationship to Graham Vale constituted a direct, undeniable conflict of interest regarding the upcoming audit of Vale Meridian Grid and its associated logistical contractors. I officially requested an immediate, documented recusal from the Blue Run Field Services investigation to protect the absolute integrity of the agency's upcoming findings. By voluntarily stepping away from the active investigation, I completely insulated myself against any future accusations of biased auditing, professional vendettas, or stolen data. I created an irrefutable, time-stamped paper trail proving my ethical compliance. Simultaneously, I began constructing a personal, legally bulletproof timeline on my own secure, private server. I only accessed public records. I archived state corporate registries, public land deeds, and publicly available federal shipment logs. I built an airtight chain of custody that absolutely no defense attorney could unravel. I pressed the send button on the ethics declaration. I watched the email vanish into the agency's secure server. I leaned back in my chair and took a long, steady breath. The air in the office suddenly tasted entirely different. The crushing humiliation of the dinner table was completely gone. The sorrow of my broken marriage had evaporated into the cold air conditioning. This was no longer a domestic dispute. It was no longer a sad story about a working-class woman being pushed out by a wealthy, arrogant family. It had escalated into a massive corporate ethics scandal, a multi-million-dollar fraud case built entirely on the backs of hurricane victims. And I, the quiet, disposable wife they had arrogantly tried to buy off with a piece of heavy cream stationery, was holding the absolute key to their destruction. It was late Thursday afternoon when I finally saw him again. The sky over Charleston had bruised into a deep, stormy purple, and the heavy, humid air clung to my skin as I walked out of the Coastal Recovery Authority building. He was standing in the far corner of the employee parking lot, leaning heavily against the driver's side door of his dark sedan. He did not come to my apartment. He did not attempt to wait in the air-conditioned lobby of my office building. He knew, with whatever small fragment of self-awareness he still possessed, that he had entirely forfeited the right to step freely into my personal spaces. He looked terrible. The polished, effortless confidence that usually radiated from him was completely gone. His tie was missing. The top two buttons of his tailored shirt were undone, and his eyes were rimmed with dark, exhausted shadows. For the first time since I met him at that weathered seafood shack 2 years ago, Graham Vale looked like a man who was terrified of the real world. I walked toward him slowly, my heels clicking a steady, unhurried rhythm against the cracked asphalt. I did not rush. I did not cross my arms defensively, and I certainly did not offer him a comforting embrace. I stopped a full 3 feet away from him, leaving a cold, undeniable physical boundary between us. "You should not be here, Graham," I said. My voice was entirely flat. It carried no anger, no sorrow, and no affection. It was the voice I used when interrogating hostile contractors. Graham swallowed hard. He looked down at his expensive shoes, then back up to my face. "I had to see you," he said, his voice cracking slightly. I had to explain what happened in that dining room. "You need to understand the context. Rose, I did not want it to happen that way." "The context?" I repeated softly. "You sat in silence while your father tried to buy my permanent disappearance for $5 million, and your mother insulted my entire existence. Please, enlighten me on the context I missed." He ran a trembling hand through his hair. He looked desperate, like a man trying to patch a shattered dam with his bare hands. "They told me it was just a temporary measure," Graham confessed, the words tumbling out of him in a rushed, panicked cadence. "My father and Carter brought me into the boardroom a week before the dinner. They said the Halcyon merger was entering a highly volatile phase, and that having an unvetted, outspoken spouse working in a state regulatory agency was creating an unacceptable risk profile for the shareholders. They promised me it was just a strategic separation. They wanted to temporarily resolve the marriage, quietly, just until the merger was fully finalized and the capital was secured. Then they said we could step back, see where the dust settled, and decide whether to reconcile privately or divorce officially." I stared at him. The sheer, breathtaking cowardice of his statement hung in the heavy air between us. It was a truth far uglier and far more degrading than his silence at the dinner table. "You agreed to temporarily resolve our marriage," I said, parsing his corporate vocabulary with absolute disgust. "You viewed me as a liability that could simply be put on hold. You thought you could pack me away in a storage unit with a cashier's check, wait out your fiscal quarter, secure your family legacy, and then decide if you wanted to take me off the shelf again." Graham flinched. "It is not like that, Rose. I was trying to protect you from their crosshairs. I was trying to buy us time." "You were trying to protect your inheritance," I corrected him sharply. "Do not dress your cowardice up as chivalry. You chose the path of least resistance. As long as your career and your trust fund did not deviate from their tracks, you were perfectly willing to let me take the hit." He looked away, unable to hold my gaze. The silence stretched out, filled only by the distant hum of highway traffic. I decided it was time to stop playing the wounded wife and step fully into the reality of the situation. "Is your family afraid of the state contractor reviews, Graham?" I asked. The question hit him like a physical blow. His head snapped back toward me, his eyes wide with sudden, unfiltered panic. He opened his mouth to deploy a practiced denial, but I cut him off. "Do not lie to me," I warned, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Do not insult my intelligence again. You pushed a separation agreement across the table that explicitly forbade me from discussing commercial data. I am an auditor for the exact agency preparing to tear apart the coastal recovery supply chains. Tell me the truth." Graham let out a long, defeated breath. The last remnants of his corporate loyalty finally fractured. "Carter pulled me aside 2 weeks ago," Graham admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He was frantic. He said the state attorney general was quietly requesting preliminary files. He said your specific department was stirring the water too close to things you had absolutely no business knowing. Things that could derail the entire Halcyon acquisition if they became public knowledge. "Blue Run Field Services," I stated clearly. Graham closed his eyes and nodded slowly. "Yes, Blue Run. Carter warned my father that you were uniquely positioned to accidentally uncover the logistics irregularities. They could not risk you staying in the family, but they also could not risk you leaving angry without a gag order. That is why they structured the settlement the way they did." Then, Graham looked at me with an expression of profound, agonizing shame. "It was not just about the confidentiality clause. Rose," he continued, his voice thick with self-loathing, They hired those private investigators to look at your financial life. They did not just want to see your background. They wanted to calculate your exact net worth. They cross-referenced your state salary against the average hourly retainer of a high-level corporate litigator. They concluded that if they pushed you out and threatened you with a breach of contract, you simply would not possess the financial ammunition to fight them in court. They knew you could not afford to drag it out. The sheer mathematical cruelty of it was staggering. They had weaponized my modest lifestyle against me. They had assumed my lack of wealth equated to a lack of power. I felt a cold, sharp smile touch the corners of my mouth, thinking of my father and his $8 billion resting quietly in the shadows. They had miscalculated so entirely that it was almost poetic. I stepped slightly closer to Graham. I looked directly into his bloodshot eyes. I needed to ask the final surgical question that would completely sever the illusion of our past. "Did you ever actually love me, Graham?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "Or did you just love the intoxicating feeling of being the man who reached down and elevated me? Did you love me as an equal, or did you just love playing the benevolent savior to a working-class girl?" Graham froze. The breath hitched in his throat. He stared at me, his face a mask of absolute devastation. It was the one question he had never possessed the courage to ask himself. He realized, in that stark parking lot, that his attraction to my simple life was not born of romance, but of ego. He liked that I did not challenge his financial supremacy. He liked feeling like the most powerful person in the room when we were together. He did not have an answer. His silence was the only answer I needed. Slowly, with a trembling hand, Graham reached into the inner breast pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a small, encrypted digital storage drive. He held it out to me. His hand was shaking so badly I could hear his watch clinking faintly against his wrist. "Give this to your legal counsel," Graham whispered. "It contains copies of Carter's internal executive communications. It proves Carter aggressively pressured the board of directors to finalize the Halcyon merger immediately, specifically before the Risk Management Committee could receive the preliminary reports regarding the state contractor audits. It proves they knew the supply chain was compromised, and they actively buried it to protect the valuation." I looked at the small metal drive resting in his palm. It was the smoking gun. It was the exact piece of internal leverage my father and I needed to detonate the boardroom. I reached out and took it, my fingers brushing against his cold skin for the very last time. "I am so sorry, Rose," Graham choked out, a single tear finally breaking loose and tracing a path down his cheek. "I am so deeply sorry for all of it." I dropped the drive into my purse and clicked the clasp shut. I looked at the man I had married, feeling absolutely nothing but a hollow, clinical pity. Trust is not repaired by a single, desperate apology. "Graham," I said, my voice as cold as winter iron, "trust is destroyed by a long, deliberate chain of choices. You made your choices. You chose the path of convenience every single time it mattered." I turned my back on him. "What happens now?" he called out to me, his voice echoing thinly across the empty parking lot. I paused, looking over my shoulder one last time. Graham was standing completely alone, trapped in the terrifying space between his past and his future. For his entire life, he had simply floated on the current of his family's immense wealth and power. Now he was finally standing on the shoreline, forced to choose. He could retreat behind the fortified walls of his family's empire and protect the lie, or he could step into the devastating light of the truth and accept the complete loss of the inherited throne he had been promised since birth. "Now," I replied calmly, "you decide who you actually are." I walked to my vehicle, got inside, and drove out of the lot. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I left him standing there in the fading light, entirely alone with the wreckage of his own cowardice. Early Monday morning, the landscape of the war shifted from the shadows of my private grief into the blinding, fluorescent light of corporate governance. Nolan Whitmore did not make a phone call, and he certainly did not request a polite meeting. He utilized the cold, unforgiving machinery of the financial system. His private wealth management firm dispatched a formal, legally binding notification directly to the corporate secretary of Vale Meridian Grid. The document was surgically brief. It stated that Nolan Whitmore, acting as the primary representative for the holding trust that controlled their largest block of preferred shares outside the founding family, would be attending the extraordinary board meeting scheduled for Thursday morning at 10 o'clock. Furthermore, he invoked his specific shareholder rights to append a mandatory item to the official meeting agenda. The requested topic was listed simply as a review of executive risk management and third-party logistical compliance. Within 4 hours of that email being processed, the impenetrable fortress of the Vale headquarters descended into absolute chaos. The internal whisper network ignited. The independent directors, men and women who were brought in to provide an illusion of objective oversight, began making frantic phone calls. Most of them only knew the Whitmore name as a dormant, historical footnote, a silent savior who had rescued the company from the brink of insolvency over a decade ago. He was a ghost in their ledger. For that ghost to suddenly materialize in the flesh, demanding to interrogate their compliance structures exactly 48 hours before the monumental Halcyon merger vote, was the equivalent of a bomb threat in the boardroom. The Vale family, however, did not surrender. They possessed the arrogant reflex of a dynasty entirely accustomed to crushing dissent. They immediately initiated their counterattack, aiming straight for my reputation. By Tuesday afternoon, their highly paid public relations consultants had discreetly activated their media contacts. Blind items and thinly veiled rumors began appearing in regional financial newsletters and elite social gossip columns. The narrative they spun was maliciously brilliant. I was not named directly, but the details were unmistakable. The articles described a socially ambitious, working-class spouse who, realizing her brief marriage to a prominent utility heir was dissolving, was now attempting to orchestrate a massive financial extortion campaign. They planted whispers that I was threatening to fabricate ethical complaints to leverage an 8-figure divorce settlement. They were actively painting me as a hysterical, greedy liability to insulate the board against anything I might say. Then came the velvet hammer. On Wednesday morning, Lenora Vale's assistant called to extend a highly unusual invitation. Lenora requested my presence for a private brunch at the heavily guarded Piedmont Country Club. The stated reason was to speak frankly, woman to woman, before things escalated beyond repair. I arrived precisely on time. The dining room was an echoing expanse of white linen, crystal chandeliers, and aggressively wealthy patrons conducting their mid-morning networking. Lenora sat at a corner table, dressed in a flawless, tailored pearl suit. She looked like a queen surveying a conquered province. "Rose," Lenora said, gesturing gracefully to the empty chair opposite her. She did not smile. "Please, sit. We have a great deal of reality to discuss." I sat down, declining the waiter's offer for a beverage. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I was not there to eat. I was there to listen to the enemy make a mistake. "I will dispense with the pleasantries," Lenora began, her voice a low, terrifyingly calm purr. "The little stunt your father is attempting to pull with the board of directors is amusing, but ultimately futile. You are letting your bruised feelings cloud your judgment. If you drag this personal dispute into the public arena, you will not just embarrass my husband. You will absolutely destroy Graham." She leaned forward, her perfectly manicured fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. She was deploying a soft threat, attempting to weaponize the lingering ghosts of my affection for her son. "Graham is standing on the threshold of securing a legacy that most people cannot even comprehend," Lenora continued, her eyes locking onto mine with predatory intensity. "If you force a spectacle, the board will lose confidence in his stability. They will strip him of his executive succession. You will leave the man you supposedly loved with absolutely nothing. Take the settlement. Rose. Protect him, if you ever truly cared for him." I looked at her, studying the absolute conviction in her eyes. "You are remarkably protective of the Halcyon merger, Lenora," I noted quietly. "Most mothers would be more concerned about their son's emotional devastation than his stock options." Lenora's eyes narrowed into sharp, dangerous slits. Her patience, always a thin veneer, finally fractured under the pressure. "You do not understand the sheer mathematics of this situation, you foolish girl," Lenora hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "This is not about a simple business transaction. If that state contractor review blows open and becomes public knowledge before the halcyon paperwork is signed, our market capitalization will evaporate in 1 week. The entire valuation will collapse. Do you understand the magnitude of the wealth you are tampering with?" I did not move a single muscle, but inside my chest, my heart gave a hard, triumphant strike against my ribs. I did not need a hidden recording device. I did not need a signed confession. Lenora had just handed me the final, irrefutable piece of the puzzle. She had not mentioned a divorce scandal affecting the stock price. She had specifically named the state contractor review. A mother solely concerned with the social optics of a mismatched marriage would never possess that granular level of operational knowledge. She knew exactly what Carter was doing with Blue Run Field Services. She knew the fraud existed. She understood the catastrophic financial risk it posed to the merger, and she was actively participating in the cover-up. The rot did not just live in the executive suites. It was being served at the family dinner table. I stood up from the table. "Enjoy your brunch, Lenora," I said smoothly. "I imagine it will be your last quiet meal for quite some time." I left the country club and drove directly to the high-rise office of my personal attorney. My lawyer, a brilliant, ruthless litigator named Sarah, was waiting for me with a stack of heavily highlighted documents spread across her glass desk. While I had been sitting with Lenora, Sarah had been meticulously tearing apart the legal architecture of my marriage. "They did not just try to silence you with the separation agreement, Rose," Sarah said, tapping a pen against a specific page. "They built a trap door into your foundation long before you even walked down the aisle." She pushed an obscure, deeply buried addendum to my original prenuptial agreement toward me. It was a section I had never been properly briefed on, buried beneath dozens of pages of standard liability waivers. The clause stated clearly that in the event of a separation, I would immediately forfeit all equity and rights to our shared residential property if I engaged in any action, public or private, that caused material damage to the reputation of the family business ecosystem. "The family business ecosystem," I read aloud. The phrase sounded as cold and evasive as the lawyers intended. It was a legally binding muzzle. If I exposed the state contractor fraud, I would be rendered completely homeless by my own prenuptial agreement. I picked up my phone and dialed Graham's personal number. He answered on the second ring, his breathing shallow and erratic. "Did you know about the ecosystem clause in the prenuptial addendum?" I asked. I stripped all emotion from my voice. I was interrogating a hostile witness. A long, agonizing silence stretched across the cellular connection. "The corporate lawyers drafted it," Graham finally whispered, his voice cracking with shame. "They told me it was just a standard operational defense mechanism for a legacy family. They said everyone in our circle signs them to protect the holding companies from vindictive spouses. I signed off on it 6 months before the wedding. I thought it was just standard governance. Rose, I swear I never thought they would actually use it as a weapon against you." He thought it was just standard governance. He had blindly signed a document granting his family the legal authority to destroy my life if I ever stepped out of line, simply because it was the polite, wealthy thing to do. That was the most terrifying revelation of all. The corruption was not a calculated, evil scheme for Graham. It was just the water he swam in. It was his normal. I ended the call without saying another word. The final illusion of the man I loved had been entirely eradicated. Thursday morning arrived with a biting, clear sky. I walked through the towering, sunlit glass atrium of the Vale Meridian Grid headquarters. I was not there as a disgruntled wife begging for a check. I was walking beside my father, Nolan Whitmore, who wore a pair of worn leather boots and a heavy canvas jacket that stood out violently against the sea of tailored Italian wool. We rode the private executive elevator up to the top floor in absolute focused silence. The elevator doors chimed and slid open. We stepped out onto the thick, noise-absorbing carpet of the executive corridor. At the far end of the hallway stood the massive double oak doors of the main boardroom. Behind those polished doors, the entire Vale family and their board of directors were waiting, desperately trying to maintain the fragile, pristine mask of their corporate empire. They had built their world on intimidation, fraudulent invoices, and the arrogant belief that they could simply purchase their own reality. I walked toward the doors, feeling the incredible, devastating weight of the truth in my hands. The game of whispers and social threats was officially over. It was time to put the paper on the table. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. I did not enter the room as a disgraced daughter-in-law summoned to face a corporate tribunal. I walked in a half-step behind my father, assuming the quiet, observing posture of an associate accompanying a principal. The expansive room was a monument to corporate intimidation, featuring a massive table carved from a single slab of polished mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlanta skyline. A dozen board members sat in high-backed leather chairs. They wore impeccably tailored suits of charcoal wool and midnight blue silk. The air smelled of expensive cologne and freshly brewed espresso. Conversations halted mid-sentence the moment we crossed the threshold. Nolan Whitmore stepped fully into the light. He had not changed his attire for the occasion. He wore his scuffed, heavy-duty leather work boots, faded denim trousers, and the same weathered canvas jacket he used when repairing engines on the river. Against the sterile, high-gloss perfection of the Vale Meridian Grid boardroom, his physical presence was a jarring, gravitational anomaly. He did not look intimidated. He looked like a man who had come to inspect a faulty piece of machinery. Victor Vale sat at the head of the table, his brow furrowed in profound confusion. He recognized my face, of course, and his eyes flashed with immediate irritation, assuming I had breached the building to create a desperate, emotional scene. Then, his gaze shifted to my father. For several seconds, Victor simply stared, trying to reconcile the image of the unassuming working-class man from the investigative reports with the confident figure standing before him. The corporate secretary, a rigidly formal man with thin spectacles, cleared his throat. He stood up and looked down at the official meeting docket. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," the secretary announced, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space, "I must officially recognize the presence of Mr. Nolan Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore is attending today as the primary trustee and beneficial owner of the Whitmore Capital Trust. According to our latest registry, his trust controls our largest block of preferred equity outside the immediate founding family. The current market valuation of his holdings is approximately $8 billion. A collective, sharp intake of breath swept around the mahogany table. It was a physical reaction from a dozen people whose entire lives were dictated by the movement of capital. Furthermore, the secretary continued, his tone remaining clinically detached, the specific class of preferred shares held by Mr. Whitmore carries explicit, binding veto authority over any foundational changes to corporate governance, including executive restructuring and large-scale acquisitions. He has requested the floor. The color drained completely from Victor Vale's face. He looked as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked from the room. The man he had dismissed as a penniless river rat, the father of the woman he had deemed utterly beneath his family's social standing, was not just a shareholder. He was the silent, architectural pillar that had kept their empire from collapsing over a decade ago. Victor's mouth opened slightly, but no words emerged. The independent directors, previously lounging with the relaxed posture of executives preparing for a rubber-stamp merger vote, immediately sat up straight. Their expressions shifted from bored complacency to high alert. They were sophisticated financial operators. They instantly understood the terrifying implications of a dormant, $8 billion behemoth waking up and walking into their boardroom exactly 48 hours before the biggest merger in the history of the corporation. My father did not gloat. He did not raise his voice or puff out his chest. He pulled out an empty chair near the center of the table and sat down, resting his calloused hands on the polished mahogany. I remained standing silently behind his right shoulder. "Good morning," Nolan said. His voice was steady, resonant, and entirely devoid of malice. I am not here to disrupt your daily operations. However, as a vested partner in the health of this enterprise, I have a fundamental question regarding the recent deployment of your legal resources. He reached into the inner pocket of his canvas jacket and withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope. I recognized it immediately. It was the exact same envelope Victor had pushed across the dining room table. Nolan placed it gently onto the table. "A few evenings ago," Nolan continued, looking directly into Victor's wide, terrified eyes, "my daughter was presented with a separation agreement. The document included a cashier's check for $5 million. That sum is immaterial to me. What concerns me is a very specific clause buried within the legal text." Nolan tapped the envelope with his index finger. "This document explicitly mandates that my daughter remain entirely silent regarding any sensitive commercial information, internal supply chain dynamics, or vendor relationships she might have observed during her marriage to Graham Vale. I am a simple man, Victor, but I know how to read a contract. You do not gag a departing spouse on commercial data unless you are actively hiding something in your ledger that you fear she will discover. I would like the board to explain exactly what my daughter was deemed too dangerous to see." Carter Vale slammed his hand flat against the table. His face was flushed dark red with a volatile mixture of panic and fury. "This is completely out of order," Carter barked, glaring at the corporate secretary and then at my father. "This is an executive boardroom, not a divorce court. We are not going to halt the proceedings of a multi-billion-dollar corporation to entertain a petty domestic family matter. She is clearly trying to leverage her father's historical shares to extract a more favorable personal settlement. If it is merely a petty family matter, Carter," a voice interjected from the far end of the table. It was Eleanor Vance, one of the most ruthless and respected independent directors on the board. She was a former federal judge who did not suffer fools. She adjusted her reading glasses and stared coldly at Carter. "If this is just a domestic dispute," Eleanor pressed, her tone slicing through Carter's bluster like a scalpel, "why did the corporation's legal counsel draft the settlement? Why does a marital separation document contain stringent language designed specifically to protect corporate transactions and vendor identities? As a director with fiduciary duties, I find that incredibly alarming right before we vote to absorb a technology firm." The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The independent directors turned their collective gaze toward the Vale family. The pristine facade of their unified front was cracking in real time. Victor looked to his eldest son, but Carter was grinding his teeth, unable to formulate a coherent legal defense. Then, Victor looked at Graham. Graham was sitting halfway down the table. He looked physically ill. His hands were clasped so tightly together on the mahogany that his knuckles were stark white. He looked up, and for a fleeting second, his eyes met mine. I offered him nothing. No encouragement, no hatred, just the cold expectation of the truth. The silence stretched on for 10 agonizing seconds. 15 seconds. The tension in the room was thick enough to stop a pendulum. "The envelope," Graham finally said. His voice was barely a whisper at first, but he cleared his throat and spoke louder, forcing the words out into the open air. "The envelope was not a standard separation protocol." Carter whipped his head around, his eyes burning with absolute betrayal. "Graham, shut your mouth. You do not know what you are talking about." "I do know," Graham replied, his voice gaining a sudden, desperate strength. He looked away from his brother and turned to address Eleanor Vance and the rest of the independent directors. "My father and my brother explicitly told me that the separation had to happen this week. They told me that her position as an auditor for the State Recovery Agency created an unacceptable risk. They said they needed to remove her from the family structure and bind her to a commercial non-disclosure agreement because of the sensitive timing of the Halcyon merger." A collective murmur erupted among the independent directors. It was the sound of a massive, multi-billion-dollar deal hitting a reinforced concrete wall. Graham Vale, the heir apparent, had just publicly testified that the executive leadership was actively using corporate funds to suppress a state auditor. Eleanor Vance did not hesitate. She unclasped her hands and sat forward. Given the unprecedented nature of this testimony from a senior executive, Eleanor declared, her voice ringing with absolute authority. And given the presence of our largest preferred shareholder demanding clarity, I am officially moving to suspend the Halcyon merger vote indefinitely. Furthermore, I propose the immediate formation of an independent special committee to investigate potential supply chain irregularities and executive misconduct. 3 other directors immediately voiced their seconds to the motion. The momentum shifted with terrifying speed. Carter jumped out of his chair skidding backward across the carpet. You cannot do this based on the speculative whining of a disgruntled wife and a man who bought his shares out of a bargain bin 10 years ago. There is zero proof of any actual misconduct. Victor Vale buried his face in his hands. He knew the fight was lost the moment the vote was delayed. In the world of high finance, a delayed merger amidst an ethics probe is a death sentence for valuation. Nolan Whitmore simply nodded his head once, a gesture of quiet acknowledgement to the independent directors. He stood up from the table. He did not say another word to Victor or Carter. He had accomplished exactly what he came to do. He had stopped the machine. As we turned to walk out of the boardroom, the frantic shouting and arguing erupted behind the mahogany doors. The board members believed the worst of the crisis had just concluded. They believed the suspension of the vote was the climax of the earthquake. They were entirely wrong. The real destruction, the surgical dismantling of Carter's fraudulent vendor network, had not even started yet. I touched the clasp of my purse, feeling the solid shape of the digital drive Graham had given me. The room had changed gravity, but the floor was about to drop out completely. "You have absolutely nothing," Carter screamed, his voice cracking with a volatile mixture of desperation and fury. He jumped up from his leather chair and pointed a shaking finger at my father and me. "This is a bluff. A pathetic, theatrical bluff. You do not have a single piece of paper to prove any actual wrongdoing. You are just a bitter woman trying to extort this family because your marriage failed." I did not match his volume. I did not let the heat of his anger ignite my own. I had spent 2 years watching these people use their wealth to shout down the rest of the world, and I knew that true power did not require a raised voice. I simply turned my head toward the heavy mahogany doors. On cue, my attorney, Sarah, pushed them open and walked into the suffocating tension of the boardroom. She carried 2 thick, leather-bound briefcases. I stepped back and yielded the floor to her. I did not need to argue emotionally. The math would do the bleeding for them. Sarah distributed perfectly bound dossiers to Eleanor Vance and the other independent directors around the table. She laid out the timeline with brutal, chronological precision. "Blue Run Field Services," Sarah began, her voice crisp and echoing off the floor-to-ceiling glass walls. She walked the board through the exact methodology of the fraud. She detailed how the shell company masked inflated prices, pushing emergency relief costs through 3 separate layers of phantom invoices. She pointed to the specific pages showing the equipment markups of nearly 200%. "Every single approval signature on those bloated state manifests," Sarah stated, looking directly at Carter, "traces directly back to Carter Vale and his immediate network of hand-picked subordinates." Carter's face drained of all color. He opened his mouth to object, but Sarah was not finished. "But the financial fraud is only half the issue," Sarah continued. She reached into her pocket and held up the small, encrypted metal drive Graham had surrendered to me in the parking lot. "These are internal executive communications provided voluntarily by a senior member of this company. They explicitly show that Carter Vale and Lenora Vale were completely aware of an impending state regulatory audit regarding these specific contractors. They recognize that my client, an auditor for the Coastal Recovery Agency, was a catastrophic legal liability to this corporation. They rushed to manufacture a marital separation, deliberately attaching a punitive commercial gag order, specifically to neutralize her before she could become a witness." Victor Vale's corporate survival instinct immediately overpowered his paternal loyalty. He saw the empire burning and immediately tried to throw his eldest son into the flames to smother them. "I knew nothing of this," Victor declared, his voice trembling as he stood up, physically distancing himself from Carter. If Carter engaged in rogue vendor approvals and illegal kickbacks, He will be terminated immediately. The corporation cannot be held responsible for the isolated criminal actions of one rogue executive. Sarah did not even blink. She simply opened the second folder in her briefcase. "Nice try, Victor," Sarah said coldly. "But we also recovered the encrypted minutes from your private risk management briefings held 6 months ago. You were warned, in writing, about the massive, inexplicable profit margin anomalies regarding Blue Run. You chose to bury the report. You chose absolute silence to ensure the Halcyon merger valuation remained spotless." The room fell into a heavy, deathly silence. The pristine facade of the Vale dynasty was entirely shattered, reduced to a pile of fraudulent paperwork and cowardly betrayals. Nolan Whitmore leaned forward, resting his calloused forearms on the polished mahogany table. "As the holder of the controlling preferred equity," my father stated, his voice ringing with absolute, unyielding authority, "I am officially supporting the emergency resolution proposed by the independent directors. Carter Vale is suspended immediately and stripped of all executive access. The Halcyon merger is permanently frozen. An independent forensic investigation will commence today, and all internal findings will be surrendered immediately to the State Attorney General and the federal regulatory agencies." Eleanor Vance called for the vote. The atmosphere in the room was entirely breathless. One by one, the independent directors raised their hands. The motion carried unanimously. For the very first time in the 80-year history of the corporation, the Vale family lost absolute control of their own boardroom. They were entirely powerless, trapped in the very cage they had built. The boardroom doors opened again. The chief corporate compliance officer walked in, flanked by 2 members of internal security. He walked directly past Victor and stopped behind Lenora's chair. The woman who had slid a $5 million envelope across a dining table to buy my silence, who had looked at me with such profound, untouchable arrogance, now looked up in absolute horror. "Mrs. Vale," the compliance officer said flatly, "as part of the immediate legal hold and the impending federal inquiry, I must ask you to surrender your personal cellular device and all external communication records regarding your correspondence with Blue Run Field Services." Lenora's perfectly manicured hands shook violently as she reached into her designer purse and placed her phone on the table. Her reign was over. Victor looked at me across the expanse of the room. His eyes were entirely broken. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a pathetic, hollow desperation. He saw his legacy, his freedom, and his entire identity dissolving into the air. "Rose, please," Victor begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whisper. "We can settle this privately. We can offer a new arrangement. Name your price. $10 million. $20 million. We will draft the wire transfer right now. Just keep the files out of the hands of the federal prosecutors. We can make this right." I looked at the man who had treated me like a disposable asset, a woman he thought he could swat away with a checkbook. "I do not want your money, Victor," I said smoothly, feeling a profound, absolute peace settle into my chest. "I want restitution. The company will establish a dedicated fund to fully reimburse the coastal municipalities you defrauded. You will publicly overhaul your entire contractor bidding mechanism, and you will submit to a completely revised, independently monitored conflict of interest standard. You will pay for this with the truth, not with a checkbook." The meeting rapidly dissolved into legal chaos. Lawyers began shouting, and security moved in to secure the executive terminals. I did not stay to watch the scavengers pick the bones. I turned and walked out of the building, my father walking quietly by my side. I stepped out into the crisp, bright afternoon air of the concrete plaza. A few moments later, the heavy glass doors opened behind me. Graham followed me out. He was no longer wearing his corporate badge. He had voluntarily surrendered his succession paperwork to the board secretary before leaving the room. He had agreed to act as a cooperating witness for the federal investigators against his own father and brother. He looked entirely exhausted, stripped of his gilded armor, but for the first time since I met him, he looked genuinely free. "I gave it all back," Graham said quietly, standing a few feet away from me. "I am going to testify. I know it does not fix what I let them do to you. I know it does not erase the cowardice, but I am not hiding behind their money anymore. I looked at him. There was no sudden, cinematic reconciliation. The damage was far too deep, the betrayal too profound for a simple embrace. We had burned the entire forest down, and you cannot build a home in the ashes. I adjusted the strap of my purse, feeling the cool breeze off the street. It is a good first step, Graham, I replied softly. I turned toward the street, preparing to walk away and leave Atlanta completely behind me. I stopped and looked over my shoulder one last time at the man I had once loved. If you really want me, I said, my voice steady and clear. This time, you have to learn how to choose the truth before you choose convenience. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please comment below to let me know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support it even more by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.